And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Arcega in Washington. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden visited Turkey this week in a bid to strengthen bilateral relations that have been strained for a variety of reasons that we will discuss in just a moment. Meanwhile, U.S.-backed Syrian Kurdish fighters say they are withdrawing to their bases east of the Euphrates River after Turkey's military and allied fighters launched a cross-border offensive on the town of Jarablus. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has more.
Turkish and Syrian fighters backed by U.S. airstrikes are pushing out pockets of Islamic State resistance from the Syrian border town of Jarablus.
It was a bad day for ISIL yesterday in Jarablus. It was another bad day for them today. And that's thanks in part to the many partners who are in our coalition.
But the fighting has put two of those U.S. partners at odds. Turkey says the goal of the surprise attack is to repel both Islamic State fighters and Kurdish forces who pursued them north after ousting them from nearby areas. Turkey has blamed Islamic State for brutal attacks on its people, including the attack on Istanbul's airport that killed dozens earlier this year. But Turkey also has been attacked for decades by the Kurdish terror group known as the PKK, which was most recently blamed for an attack on a convoy that wounded 3 Turkish troops Thursday. The U.S. separates Syrian Kurdish rebels and the PKK, a distinction Turkey has not made. The Pentagon is working to keep all allies fighting against one common enemy.
And I'm joined in Washington by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb to talk about more on what's going on there, along with VOA National Security correspondent Jeff Seldin. Thank you for joining us both today. Carla, I do want to discuss this latest offensive in Syria, but before I get there, I want to get a sense of the mood right now in Turkey. It's rather a complicated time for the country, isn't it? I mean, with multiple enemies both inside and outside its borders.
Oh yes, it's a very terrifying time for the Turkish people. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of confusion going on because they just had a coup, an attempted coup attempt right internally, and then they've been fighting, as I said in the piece, they've been fighting the PKK for decades that has been attacking them. And so with this fight in the south, there are Kurds involved, and Turkey has lumped Kurds together as bad. We don't want to really associate with them.
They've got like enemies everywhere.
Right, and so with the Islamic State, the Kurds are fighting the Islamic State with the U.S. And so Turkey has been very cautious not to help the Kurds. They want the Kurds to stay away from their border because they are associating the terror group PKK with the Kurds. And so because of that association, it's making a very complicated issue right along that border.
Sure. It's a big juggling, balancing act, Jeff. And while all this is going on, this week there was a deadly suicide attack near the Syrian border at a wedding. Some 54 people killed. What can you tell us about what happened there? Because there seems to be a lot of conflicting reports about what happened.
There still are some conflicting reports. Initially, the report was coming out of Turkey that it was a child or a young teen who had carried out the suicide attack. Later, some officials said it wasn't, while some officials were still saying it was. But the bottom line is that the death and destruction wreaked during that wedding seems to have precipitated, or at least given the Turkish government the motivation to say, okay, now's the time to move its forces, work with the Syrian rebels, and clear out the border area and what they're calling Operation Euphrates Shield.
Is this an Islamic State attack then?
The Islamic State hasn't claimed responsibility, but often in Turkey they don't claim responsibility for the terror attacks. Even the attack on the Istanbul airport, which was blamed on the Islamic State, there was no clear claim of responsibility. But the Turkish government blamed Islamic State. There have been some other border attacks more recently, and they've blamed the PKK for those. But in this case, the Turkish government blamed Islamic State, said it's time to move, and began the operation for Jarablus.
And Carla, I mean, to complicate matters even more, relations between the U.S. and Turkey have not been the best these days, especially since the failed coup attempt. Right. And also Erdogan's pivot towards Russia. How would you describe relations right now between the United States and Turkey?
Well, the United States continues to say that relations are fine, but this all started with this coup. The the government of Turkey was very suspicious of the U.S. There was a conservative daily that was blaming General John Campbell, who used to head the NATO forces in Afghanistan, saying that he was somehow related. There's been absolutely no
There were suggestions that the United States knew about this attack prior to it.
Yes, and then afterwards, to go even further, General Votel, who runs all of the U.S. operations in the Middle East, he was quoted as saying that, yeah, he did understand that some military allies that they had been working with were arrested in this coup. And then President Erdogan took that out of context and said, oh my goodness, the U.S. is supporting the coup, which clearly was not the case if you watched the comments. But it's been a big back and forth, so that spawned the closeness with Russia. So you've really got to wait and see how this is going to pan out, but it may not be a bad thing. You have to really pay attention to what's going on because the Turks have been very suspicious of the Kurds. Mm-hmm. The U.S. has been friends with the Kurds, but Russia has also been friends with the Kurds. So as analysts say, if the Turks can just decide that Islamic State is the biggest enemy here, I think more could happen from Turkey in the future, but we've just got to see if they're going to make that decision.
And I assume, Jeff, that some of the friction is based on U.S. refusal to extradite this Turkish cleric who now lives in Pennsylvania, Fethullah Gulen. Is there any evidence presented to the United States that this man was in fact co-conspirator of this coup?
Well, Turkey immediately said he was and started making overtures toward the United States that it was time to extradite him to Turkey. The U.S. wasn't receptive. There's been more talk. The State Department has said recently that they have gotten an official request that they're reviewing. Of course, that's something that the United States Justice Department ultimately is going to have to decide. The pressure has been mostly on the White House, on President Obama, Vice President Biden, and of course, Biden, in his trip to Turkey, was trying to repair some of the ties and get everybody back on the same track. Mm-hmm. But it's just another one of those fibers in what's a very complex tapestry of what's playing out right now along the Turkish-Syrian border.
But Carla, in spite of all this, it hasn't seemed to have impacted Turkey's ability to strike targets in Syria, as we saw in your report.
Right, and the United States is still using Incirlik Air Base as a launching point for some of these airstrikes. There were 4 strikes in the Manbij-Jarablus area just today, and the U.S. is using A-10s and F-16s. Those A-10s are coming from Incirlik Air Base. So while there was a pause while everything was being sorted out, everything that's happened after those first couple of days of the coup has not given any indication that Turkey's not being a strong supporter in the fight against Islamic State.
Yeah, I'm out of time, Jeff, but I know you had an interesting take on that attack in Jarablus and the fact that even the Islamic State retreat is part of their strategy. And I want any of our viewers to actually check out our website, the story on that Jarablus attack. Thank you again, Carla, and thank you, Jeff. We're going to take another break right now, but when we come back, the U.S. National Park System turns 100 years old. We'll profile a photographer who's made it her life's work to capture the beauty of America's national parks. And just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.